Right, I think we'll make a start now. So firstly, welcome to this FAS Farm Advisory Service funded webinar tonight. My name's Dr. Cara Campbell. I am a senior consultant and area manager with SAC Consulting in the Campbelltown office. A little bit of housekeeping first of all. For any questions tonight, if you could pop them in the Q&A box. You'll find that at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do questions at the end. So if you just pop them in as we're going along, and we will do them at the end. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Annie Williams. She is going to discuss mineral supplementation in cattle tonight. Annie previously worked for Agrimin as an animal scientist and then latterly as an export sales manager and technical support. She currently works for CL as a business development manager and runs her own mineral consultancy company, who she works with vets, nutritionists and farmers. She did her PhD at Harper Adams University and looked at the effect of nano copper oxide and nano zinc oxide as on mineral bioavailability, performance, and health of ruminants. So I am going to hand over to Annie to discuss her subject of mineral supplementation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Cara. My PhD is an absolute mouthful. Gonna keep it a little bit more simple than that tonight. Can you see my screen okay? Yeah, cool. Right, I'm going to talk broadly about mineral nutrition in cattle. I'm going to cover macro minerals, micro minerals, and a little bit on vitamins. And for my first slide, I kind of thought about what is the title of this webinar. The title was Mineral Supplementation and Where to Start. And I kind of thought if I was giving advice directly on farm to a farmer specifically, how would I start to tackle that question? And I think the key thing with minerals, and probably something that independent consultants will be recommending, is working out whether you actually need to supplement at all. So an animal has a requirement for minerals, and we need to work out whether our diet is actually meeting that requirement or not. If it's not meeting that requirement, we need to work out, can we make it meet that requirement, and does that require the use of supplementation? If it does, we then need to work out which minerals we need to supplement. So I'm going to talk in detail about a few of the minerals that we commonly supplement and why we do that. But it could be that simply we need to supplement certain minerals because they're just not there in the diet. They're in really low quantities compared to what the animals require. It could be that we start to think about supplementing minerals because there's antagonism in the diet, which means that the mineral isn't available to the animal. So I'll talk a little bit about those, particularly when it comes to our trace elements and the effect that they can have on animal health and productivity. So how could you identify whether you've got antagonism going on, and therefore what would you do about it? I think something that's been talked about a little bit more recently, and I was at a conference over in France last week where this was talked about a little bit, and it's fairly new maybe to mineral nutrition, is thinking also about minerals a little bit more as what we refer to as a nutraceutical. So can we enhance performance using certain minerals? And if so, what are those minerals? So I'm thinking at the moment, I'm sat in an office in Shropshire. It's currently 29 degrees and heat stress is very much on the agenda. There is starting to be some evidence that perhaps we can use antioxidants as a nutraceutical to try and lower heat stress in cattle. So I'll touch on a little bit of that. And then I'm also going to touch on what's the best supplement for your system. So that's probably the most common question that I get asked is, okay, I've worked out I need to supplement, now tell me which one to use. And there is no one size fits all to that question. We have to think about the system. So if we're running extensive beef compared to fully TMR based dairy, the supplements that suit those systems will be really different. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that and where the value from a supplement can be. How do you know that you're supplementing effectively? A little bit on mineral diagnostics. But what I'm going to talk a lot about, and those that know me will hear me refer to balance all the time. And mineral nutrition is a balance, and it's really critical that we get that balance right. We don't want to undersupply cows with minerals. That will have a negative effect on their performance. And in the worst case scenarios, we'll end up in clinical mineral deficiencies, which will start to impact health, fertility, that sort of thing, give us direct diseases that are a result of mineral nutrition. But we also don't want to oversupplement. So an animal has a requirement for mineral. We want to take them into the normal range, but we don't want to take them any higher. So the predominant reason why we used to say that was because of this risk of oversupply, this risk of toxicity. And for some minerals, that's much more critical than others. So if we think of a range that mineral can be in within the animal, some minerals have a much tighter range where we're within this normal range than others. So as Cara mentioned, for example, my PhD was in copper. The range for copper in blood of cows is actually really quite narrow. We can take them relatively easily into this oversupply, into this risk of toxicity compared to other trace elements or other minerals. So it's really important that we get this balance right and we try and fill this minimum requirement, but we don't oversupply. And like I say, the predominant reason why we used to say that was purely just thinking about the animal itself and how it's going to perform. But I think what's probably come onto the agenda more recently is also thinking about sustainability. So if we're significantly oversupplying mineral, the animal's quite good for a lot of minerals at regulating that. So it will start to excrete some of that excess mineral, either in urine or in feces. It depends on the mineral, and it depends on its pathway, metabolic pathway through the animal, which type of excretion we get. But for a lot of minerals, we'll then get significant excretion, which effectively then ends up in the environment. So as well as thinking about it in terms of, are we meeting animal requirement? Have we got a risk of deficiency? Do we want to oversupply? Have we then got a risk of toxicity? We're also starting to see a little bit more forward thinking on terms of, is this actually sustainable? We need the most sustainable way of feeding animals and trying to avoid that excessive excretion of mineral into the environment. So I thought I'd just show, and I know most people are probably familiar with what a forage analysis would look like, or if you're on a TMR system, what a TMR analysis would look like for minerals. But this is how I would go about starting to work out, does my diet meet animal requirement? So for each of the minerals shown on this analysis, the animal has a requirement for the majority. Some of them are on here because they're antagonists of other minerals. So I'd be looking at, okay, let's take one of the trace elements. So let's take copper in this analysis. It's 7.5 milligrams per kilogram. I'd be working out, does that meet the requirement of my animals? Okay, the answer is probably no. So therefore, I need to start thinking about what I'm going to do about that. First of all, do I think this is a true representation of the diet going in front of those cows? Second of all, does the number tell me that it's going to meet requirement? And third, if it doesn't, what am I going to do about it? So that would be my first sort of assessment of this analysis. I would then go, okay, so I've looked at these minerals independently. I now need to consider the effect that antagonists might have. So there's two things going on here. We can see we've got antagonists at the bottom. So we've got a relative copper antagonism. That's coming from our values from sulfur, molybdenum, and iron. and telling us that for this example, our relative copper antagonism is pretty high. So it's likely that a lot of the copper in this is not actually available to the animal. But we also want to consider things like the soil contamination index. So that soil contamination tells us that in this example, in the ensiling process, there's quite a lot of soil in that. A lot of minerals in soil are not available to the animal. So although they may be there on our silage analysis, when the animal actually metabolizes this silage, they're not necessarily available. So I would always take that into consideration when looking at my numbers for the individual elements. So I'd be saying, does my forage meet requirement? Are there antagonists that may affect mineral absorption? Have I got a lot of soil contamination within this forage? And if so, what does that tell me about the overall picture and whether this might fulfill the requirements of the animals or not? And then lastly, this question that I've mentioned that I've kind of added on is that, are there any special nutraceutical requirements of your cows? So I deal with a whole variety of cattle across the industry, from sort of beef cows to 7,000 litre dairy all the way through to sort of 13,000 litre dairy cows. And their requirements are different. The pressure that we're putting on those animals to perform is different. And therefore, I think we need to start thinking of their mineral nutrition a little bit more differently. So these are the minerals that I'm going to go through tonight. The ones I've highlighted are the ones that I'm going to go through in detail, not because they're more important than the others, but because they're the ones that I tend to get more questions on in cattle, or perhaps where we've seen imbalances more commonly in cattle. So for example, we're getting a lot of questions at the moment surrounding phosphorus and phosphorus cycling and how much phosphorus we should be supplying into the diet of cattle. Or for copper, I see significant oversupply of copper into diets. So we can talk a little bit about that. But I will go through in less detail the ones that aren't highlighted as well, and just explain why they're important to consider in the ration, even if perhaps they generally cause us less issues when we're balancing rations being fed to cattle. So starting with the macro minerals. So a macro mineral is something that's required in grams per kilo, as opposed to milligrams per kilo, or will quite often be on your analysis of forage as a percentage rather than as a milligrams per kilo. But starting with calcium, because calcium is the most abundant mineral in the body. So 99% of it is stored in the skeleton. So when we think about the demand being put particularly on dairy cows, but also on some of our sucklers that are producing lots of milk, that's a lot of mobilization of calcium out of the skeleton that we're expecting them to do, because they're storing 99% of their body calcium there. So outside of the skeleton, calcium's really important for the nervous system and muscle contraction. That's why we see milk fever presenting in the way that it does. It's because of those links and calcium's importance in a healthy nervous system and helping those muscles to contract that we see milk fever. It's also linked with vitamin D. So really important that we don't think of calcium in isolation, but particularly when we're thinking about early lactation, we're really considering how we mobilize calcium. But importantly, I think sometimes it's really easy to get sort of funneled into only thinking about calcium in relation to milk fever. We've also got to think about it as important for milk yield and growth, and that the demand being put on high yielding cows for milk yield in terms of their calcium requirement is actually really high. And we need to consider that when we're rationing for milking cows. But coming on to milk fever and why we see it, we essentially see it because we get a sudden increase in demand for calcium at calving. So the cow goes through the dry period, she's fed a ration throughout that period, and then she calves and she suddenly starts producing milk, and that milk contains calcium. She suddenly has to mobilize calcium to get there. Now, the way that she can put calcium into milk is either by mobilizing it from the bone or by absorbing it from the diet. So we need to think of the ways in which that we can help her to do that. So how can we help her to mobilize calcium? And there's a few different ways that we ration cows in order to help them mobilize calcium from the bone. Probably the most common way that most people have heard of is using a decad diet. So acidifying the blood of the animal to try and promote mobilization out of the bone. So we see that in particularly high yielding dairy cows, really effective if you can get it right. But there are some challenges to doing it, particularly in UK systems. So in order to get decad right, we need to try and lower the amount of potassium in silage, because potassium drives a higher decad value, which can throw our decad out and make it impossible to achieve. We also need to think about whether we've got enough vitamin D and enough magnesium in the diet to allow the cow to mobilize that calcium from that decad diet. So yeah, that's our challenges to achieving decad, particularly if we have got rations or farms where the only option for dry cows is to include grass silage. It's much easier to achieve decad if you can take grass silage out of the diet, or lower it to probably less than about 3 kilos of grass silage in that diet. If not, it is quite hard to achieve, and you are on a bit of a knife edge with decad. You really do have to get it right. Otherwise, if you don't get your values low enough, you will still see cows with milk fever. A couple of the other options are, if grass silage is our only option, we have to feed those dry cows a diet with a significant proportion of grass silage in it. Quite often our best option in that would be a calcium binder. So we're effectively lowering the calcium content of the forage significantly so that the cow has to start to mobilize her own calcium. So calcium binders are really, really effective in that situation. The only thing that I would be aware of is, ideally, we only want to be feeding them to close-up dry cows. So a little bit more tricky if we're managing the dry cows as one group. And also we absolutely have to be certain that the cow moves straight out of the dry cow group as soon as she calves. Must not feed any calcium binder post-calving, because we want as much calcium available to that cow when she starts milking as possible. But a really effective way of feeding dry cows, if we have to feed them things like rations with lots of grass silage. There are other options. So we can do things like what we'd refer to as standing hay. So a relatively low quality ration, particularly useful for lower yielding animals, possibly need to supplement if we've got higher yielding animals. We can do things like forage and dry cow rolls. Quite often dry cow rolls with some forage will provide us what we call a semi-decad diet. So we're not going to full acidification, but we have got that semi-decad going on to try and reduce our milk fever. So yeah, there are options for milk fever. One of the challenges that's on the slide that perhaps I haven't mentioned would be high calcium forages. Always worth getting it tested to see how much calcium is in the forage. If there's too much available in the dry cow period, depending on which strategy we're choosing, then that can again stop the cow from mobilizing those. But yeah, really important that we avoid milk fever. It has lots of knock-on effects on things like ketosis, and also affects the cow's performance all the way through its next lactation. And then when we get into lactation, we want to be thinking about the importance of calcium on milk yield, and how can we help a cow to perform based on the rationing that we're doing for our macro minerals, including calcium. So the other one that I'm going to discuss in a little bit more detail is phosphorus. And I have to say, phosphorus never kind of used to feature in my presentations. It's kind of come much more onto the agenda probably in the last couple of years. I think it just used to be almost accepted that cattle were supplemented with phosphorus. And now I guess that's undergoing a little bit more critique. Going back to where we were with calcium, what is really important with calcium and phosphorus is that we don't consider them in isolation. We have to think about the ratio between calcium and phosphorus. Sometimes some of the signs that we'll see that are potentially an indication of a phosphorus issue are actually because our calcium phosphorus ratio is out. And if we start to adjust that ratio, we might see an improvement in how those animals are performing. But phosphorus, again, is a macro mineral, so supplied in the diet at grams per kilo. The second most abundant mineral in the body. And again, 80% of it is found in bones and teeth. So that is how our cattle are storing their phosphorus. Really important for bone formation and maintenance. But also if we start to think of our minerals and how they're behaving and how they're affecting our animals performing, phosphorus also has a number of metabolic functions and affects feed efficiency. So I think there's a greater attention on phosphorus at the moment, probably because of its environmental implications. Again, going back to that graph at the start, if we're oversupplying phosphorus, then we can see significant excretion. That excretion of phosphorus ends up in the environment and potential implications there. So what might we see if the diet is deficient in phosphorus? And I've underlined and highlighted might here because it's really difficult to put a definite on what you'll see with minerals. This could be caused by a number of things. So it could be that simply our energy protein balances in the diet are wrong. It could be that we've got a trace element imbalance. It's really hard to nail down. You will specifically see this, but with phosphorus, what we might see is a reduced appetite. We might see pica. So that's again a really common question that I get asked, which mineral is causing this? And it can be difficult to pin it down onto exactly what is causing it, because like I say, it could be something more basic in our nutrition that's actually causing that rather than a mineral imbalance. We start to see, as we do with most minerals where we get an imbalance, a reduced milk yield and infertility. So it's the animal not performing as well as it could be. And it would probably require further investigation to try and investigate why. We'd have to look at the ration and find out, have we got a mineral imbalance? Have we got a deficiency of one? What is happening that is causing us some of these subtle but important changes in the animal's performance? And what I've added in here, I think it's really important to remember that when we're talking about phosphorus and we're talking about phosphorus nutrition, that ruminants are different to monogastrics. So ruminants obviously have a microbiome in their rumen that is aiding and doing significant amounts to their diet to change it from the diet that the ruminant itself actually ingests. So we've got things like production of microbial crude protein. We've also got microbial phytase, which is allowing them to utilize phytate as a phosphorus source. So just something to bear in mind when we're thinking about ruminants versus monogastrics and some of the conversations that are happening around utilization of minerals. I would add to that a lot of the minerals that I'm going to talk about tonight, the availability of their mineral from the plant, so from the grass, from the silage, from the grain, however we're feeding it, is similar to supplementation. So similar to some of the supplements that are on the market that are then absorbed by the ruminant. Phosphorus is a little bit different. The inorganics that we supplement do tend to be a little bit more available to the cow than plant phosphorus. So that's just a little bit of a caveat on that, which is perhaps different to other minerals. Finally, on phosphorus, I just wanted to mention that the issues surrounding deficiency are more common in grazing or forage-fed cattle than TMR. And that is simply because of the concentration of phosphorus in those crops. So cereals tend to have a higher concentration of phosphorus than grasses, or that we then obviously ensile, and therefore we tend to get more issues in animals that are just forage fed. And sugar beet, though, in particular, is particularly low in phosphorus, and definitely something that we should bear in mind when we're rationing. The final macro mineral that I'm going to talk about in detail is magnesium. And I'm going to just talk about magnesium simply because I guess we've had a really interesting year in terms of grass growth. I would say that grass growth coming into the autumn is still a risk. So I just wanted to mention it in case it's not kind of high on people's agendas and we haven't considered the risk of staggers, which I think is probably coming depending on where in the country you are. So with magnesium, again, we've got about 60 to 70% present in the skeleton, and it's responsible as a catalyst for many enzymes. So I've put think lubrication of the body's processes. This is actually a phrase that I've stolen from a conference that I was at, and I really liked it. So it's kind of starting to think about the rest of your diet. So the energy you put into your diet or the protein that you put into your diet as the fuel. So that's what keeps you going from day to day. If you stop eating or your cows, their dry matter intake stops and you're not providing enough energy, we'll see a dip in the performance of those animals really quickly. Yeah, that if we take that fuel away, we change their performance really quickly. Whereas minerals, we need to think of those as providing the lubrication. So they're making those processes happen. They're allowing the animal to use the fuel. So if we take them away, we don't see the response as quickly as we do to taking the fuel away, because it's just lubricating the process. But it doesn't mean that it's any less important that we get it right, because eventually we have the same result where the animal is not performing, or perhaps we go into clinical disease in the worst case scenario, as we do if we take away those major nutritional things like energy and protein. It's just a case of how quickly that happens. So magnesium, important as a catalyst for enzymes, again, important for muscle contraction and also important for a healthy rumen microbiome. And our cattle work synergistically with their microbiome. So we need to keep that working in order to keep a healthy, productive animal. So in terms of what we were talking about, and this was feeding dry cows and how to avoid milk fever, it's really useful to increase magnesium in dry cow diets to help to mobilize calcium. So that's one place where I'd really pay attention to how much magnesium we've got going into the diets of cattle, is when we're thinking about how can we allow that animal to mobilize its calcium. The other place where we've got to pay particular attention is where we're thinking about grass staggers. So grass staggers is where magnesium in the blood falls rapidly, so it responds directly to a low magnesium being supplied in the diet. And if we leave that untreated, mortality is around 30%. So really serious and something we really need to consider. And generally, we only used to consider it in the spring. I think we're actually starting to see more cases in the autumn than we're seeing in the spring. Whether that's because we've got different grass growth patterns now, or whether that's because we're just being a little bit too, we're on top of it in the spring and we're not thinking about it so much in the autumn, I'm not sure, but we definitely seem to be seeing a number of cases happening in the autumn. So it happens because the concentration of magnesium is low. So things like rapidly growing grass, or it could be rapidly growing grass and our concentration of potassium is high. So if potassium's high, potassium acts essentially as an antagonist stops that animal absorbing the magnesium that's it requires, and therefore essentially creates a gap in requirement. So we've got how much an animal requires to go about its normal lubrication of the body's processes, and then we've got how much is in our forage, and then we've got the addition of how much is in the forage that is available to be used by the animal because of potassium. And then we might be in a situation where actually we're not meeting animal requirement, and we need to think about the supplementation that is required there. So that's where I would particularly be paying attention to magnesium. And I would be thinking about that coming into autumn, particularly from this hot spell. Are we then going to get a cooler, wetter spell, lots of rapid grass growth, and therefore potentially a risk period? So moving on to the trace elements, and again, I'm going to talk about 3 trace elements here. And again, just to reiterate, not because they're more important than others, but just because we see more issues or I get more questions on these particular ones. So starting with copper. So copper's involved in over 300 key enzymes in the body and has critical effects on fertility, growth, and the immune system. The critical thing about copper is that we can't think about it in isolation in the diet. So it's subject to significant antagonism by sulfur, molybdenum, and iron. So what effectively happens is you have all those elements in your forage that you feed your cattle. Those elements then go into the rumen and they interact. When they interact with copper, they bind to it, and that copper then can't be used by the animal. So it's excreted. So although the copper was originally there in our forage when we fed it, it's not available for use by the animal as part of an enzyme. That's what we'd call a secondary copper deficiency or a secondary copper responsive disorder. And probably that affects about 95% of the animals where copper deficiency is a problem. We only see about 5% of the time where we've got a real true low concentration of copper in the forage. 95% of the time, we've got a lowering of copper availability in the forage because of that antagonism. Now, although I'm primarily talking about deficiency here, copper is also the most over-supplemented trace element. So there's been quite a lot of work done, probably now over the last 10 years, looking at over-supplementation of copper, particularly in the dairy industry. Much less of a problem in the beef industry. In fact, probably in the beef industry, we do see significantly occurring low concentrations of copper in the diet, where the animals may benefit in terms of performance in increasing copper in the diet. But for dairy, we see a lot of copper going into diets, which is unnecessary. It's over supplementation, it's oversupply, and potentially starts to have a negative effect. So what I would say is use with caution. Copper is stored in the body and stores can build over time. So a lot of the trace elements that are coming up or that I'm going to show in the next few slides, the animal doesn't store very well. With copper, that is absolutely not true. When an animal ingests copper, it then transports that copper through the digestive tract and to the liver. It then stores that copper in the liver, and the copper is released into the blood under what we call homeostatic control. So that means keeping levels the same. We're trying to keep levels of copper in the blood the same. So the animal slowly releases copper into the blood to keep those levels the same, depending on how much copper is being used. If we're not careful, if we've got significant oversupply, those stores of copper in the liver are not being used as quickly as the animal is ingesting copper, and we get a buildup of those stores over time. So it can limit fertility, and we've got to be bearing in mind that it's a balance between under and oversupply of copper in terms of that limit on fertility. I really would suggest that people test before supplementation if possible, and that liver is the preferable test to blood. And I'll come on to a little bit more detail on testing in a few slides time. But the little graphic of plasma copper just gives you an example of some plasma results that I've seen recently. And we would say a level of 19 or higher is too much. So these animals, we are definitely seeing an oversupply of copper. There's too much copper in the diet of these animals, and it is going to start to impede their performance. So really thinking about our balance of copper in the diet between copper itself and its antagonists, and making sure that if we are supplementing, we're supplementing at an appropriate level and that it is necessary. So the other one that I'm going to talk about is iodine. So iodine is vital for the development of the thyroid gland and production of thyroid hormone, and thyroid hormones control energy metabolism. So iodine can have a direct effect on how our cattle are performing. If we haven't got enough iodine in the diet, we'll see low daily live weight gains or low milk yields, depending on how we're measuring performance. Anything that is affected by how the body metabolizes energy is going to be affected by iodine. So that includes differences in demand for cattle between summer and winter. So obviously winter, colder weather, higher metabolic rates, we see an increased demand for iodine in those animals. And that's something we need to consider in our rations. One thing that I just wanted to mention, because although it's sort of 28 degrees today, winter is definitely on its way. And for anybody overwintering cattle, particularly on a brassica crop, brassicas contain goitrogens. And I'm going to say the word again that I know I've said a lot. A goitrogen is an antagonist of iodine. So if we're out wintering cattle on brassicas, we need to think about the availability of iodine in those rations. Probably in most cases, we need to be thinking about supplementing iodine to those cattle because of that goitrogenic effect. So we're not getting that iodine absorption into the thyroid. We're going to have that negative effect on that animal's performance. And this is even more important if those cattle are pregnant. So during pregnancy, the cow passes iodine from her to the calf, so that when that calf is born, it's born with its own supply of iodine. If that doesn't happen and that calf is not born with sufficient iodine, then we get these calves that are slow, floppy, don't want to get going, really difficult to get them to get up and suck. That is a lot of the time because we've undersupplied iodine to that cow during pregnancy. So although we need to think about that in any cow that's pregnant, it's even more important that we consider it if we're overwintering on brassicas, which are going to have that goitrogenic effect on iodine and potentially stop that iodine being absorbed into the thyroid. So yeah, just something to think about if you're planning on out wintering. The final trace element that I'm going to talk about is selenium. And selenium has lots of roles within the body. It's really important, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about some potential new research showing some nutraceutical effects of selenium. So selenium, as it is in terms of a nutritional requirement of the animal, is vital for growth, vital for muscle development, important for liver function. It has an antioxidant function. It helps the immune system. It's important for fertility. There's a whole host of different roles that selenium plays within the body. Really important for bull fertility. So quite often we get people thinking only about their cows, also need to think about those bulls, and are they getting a diet that's sufficient in minerals to allow them to perform? So lots of roles of selenium that we can think about. But one of the things I just wanted to mention as a consideration is the role of selenium and vitamin E. So selenium and vitamin E essentially work together in the body of the animal as an antioxidant. So they're removing toxins. And we need to think about their supply in the diet and consider both of them in order to get an animal to perform at optimum. Some of the new research is actually showing us that perhaps when we put animals under stress, so in current conditions, I'm thinking about heat stress, that actually supplementation of selenium and vitamin E at slightly higher levels than we may have traditionally supplied can actually aid the antioxidant function of those animals and allow them to be more resilient to heat stress. So just something to add in terms of some of the new research that's coming in minerals and how we're seeing that. We're seeing a little bit similar for zinc, and perhaps zinc starting to aid performance in dairy cows. And that's probably where mineral nutrition is going next, not just thinking about the requirements of the animals, but thinking about, is there things that we can do to aid the performance of those animals? So when we look in books at requirements or what our intake should be of minerals, they're telling us what our nutritional requirements are. They're not going over and above and looking for, are there any positive effects that there might be of supplying those nutrients in even higher values. So yeah, just something to mention. So I've covered the minerals that I've highlighted, but I just wanted to mention the others. So in terms of our macro minerals, covered calcium, phosphorus, magnesium. There are other macro minerals in the diet that are important to consider. So sodium, chloride, potassium, sulfur, particularly as an antagonist, and evaluating how much sulfur there is in the diets. Sodium, chloride, potassium, all playing roles within those DCAD values that are affecting whether we get milk fever. Sodium important as a nutrient itself, and there is evidence that suggests that sodium is one of the only minerals that an animal will actively seek. If it's low in the diet, it will look for a sodium source to increase its sodium concentration in the body. So yeah. The trace minerals, so I've talked about copper, selenium, and iodine. Cobalt, zinc, and manganese are also an important consideration. So the role of cobalt is for the rumen microorganisms to convert it to vitamin B12. So it doesn't actually have a role itself. Its role is to be vitamin B12, but we tend to supply diets with cobalt rather than the B12. And then the role of vitamin B12 is in the energy pathway, effectively. So allowing an animal to extract or to create glucose from the energy that we're supplying it in its diet. So if we don't feed enough cobalt, we don't get enough vitamin B12, we potentially have negative implications on performance because we're not allowing that animal to extract all the energy that it could get out of its diet. We also need to consider zinc. So zinc important for skin, hoof health, involved in a number of enzymes in the body. And like I say, starting to see some evidence around improved performance using zinc. Manganese, really important for skeletal development. So definitely an important consideration in pregnant cows, that we're getting enough manganese into them. They can then pass that on to the calves. Otherwise, we can get calves born with skeletal disorders. And I just wanted to mention the vitamins, because I always tend to only talk about minerals, but vitamins are always an important role in the body as well. And the ones that we tend to consider are vitamin A, D, E, and then I've just added B12 on there because of that conversion of cobalt to B12. But yeah, need to be considering the value of those in the diet, their antioxidant function, vitamin D consideration, particularly in housed cattle. So are we getting enough vitamin D into cows that are potentially not getting that much sunlight? Are we getting enough vitamin D into animals to help them to mobilize the calcium that we need them to mobilize at certain points in their production cycle. So all those things definitely need to be considered. I just wanted to touch on testing and diagnostics, because I think it's becoming much more common to test animals for minerals, which is great. But how do we start to go about doing it? How do we interpret those results? And I've put the background on this slide as a puzzle, because I think that's how we need to think about it. When we're thinking about mineral nutrition and how we start to decipher, should we be supplementing? Is the diet that we're doing effective? If we supplement, how do we know whether that's effective? We need to start thinking of it as putting this puzzle together that gets us to a point where we can be sure that the mineral supply in our diet is not limiting the animal's performance. So like I said before, where I would start is looking at our diet analysis. So if we think about what our animal requires, is our diet supplying that? We can then go a little bit of a step further and start to look at testing the animal itself. So for some minerals, we'll be looking at performance responses. Do we get a response to supplementation? For some minerals, we're looking at blood sampling and liver testing to see whether our levels in those animals are actually optimum. So I've just given an example of some of the testing that we might do. So for iodine, we'd be looking at blood sampling and testing some plasma inorganic iodine. So that is quite literally the level of iodine that is in the blood. So how much iodine is available to the thyroid for absorption, for conversion into enzymes to help our metabolic rate function in those animals. So the iodine's a really simple test. And it used to be a really expensive test. We are seeing the price of iodine testing coming down, still more than the other minerals, but certainly if we're having problems at calving with slow weak calves, definitely a consideration in terms of getting that iodine supplementation right. I think iodine's one of those where if you've ever done it wrong and had animals with low iodine and had calves that are really slow and dopey, you never do it again, because it's an absolute nightmare to deal with, but such a simple solution to supplement during pregnancy to prevent. So a really simple test for iodine, and an on the spot of, is our current diet supplying this animal with enough iodine or not? That's simply what we're testing there. With selenium, we're also testing blood. And there are lots of different ways that we can test blood for selenium. We can do a similar test that we've just done for iodine. We can do plasma selenium. We can do whole blood selenium. What we tend to do in the UK is glutathione peroxidase. So where I mentioned when we were on the selenium slide that the important role of selenium is as an antioxidant, that antioxidant is glutathione peroxidase. So essentially, when we're measuring glutathione peroxidase in the blood, we're doing that active form of selenium and saying, is the current selenium status of these cattle correct? So that's what we've been measuring for selenium. Like I say, other ways of measuring it, but that's the predominant way. But what's really important there is the interpretation of the result. So if we're measuring iodine as plasma inorganic iodine, that tells us, does our diet right now meet requirement? If we're measuring selenium as glutathione peroxidase, that tells us, does our diet probably 2 or 3 months ago meet selenium requirement? Because we've had to go through a process of converting it to an enzyme. So really important to when we're deciphering results and we're interpreting those mineral results, that we think about, what does this actually mean in terms of the animal and its mineral supply? We can do vitamin B12, we can do copper. So copper, I would always be suggesting that we do it in the liver, not the blood. You can run it in the blood, it's just that not that useful in terms of interpretation. So as I said, copper in the blood is under homeostatic control. So the animal will try and maintain its copper in the blood for as long as it possibly can. So we only see changes in the blood if we get our liver copper reserves dropping really, really low. And then we start to see copper in the blood fall. But at that point, we're already effectively in copper deficiency. Or we go the other way. If we get copper in the liver getting really, really high, so we're reaching toxic levels, we then might see blood copper start to come up as the animal starts to have no choice but to release some of that copper in the liver. Whereas if we start to measure it in the liver, we get a real idea of what is the amount of copper that these cattle are storing. Is it adequate? Are we supplying enough in the diet? Are we supplying too much? What are the effects of our antagonists in the diet? So what I really wanted to highlight in terms of testing and diagnostics, even with forage analysis, but particularly on bloods and liver, is that the way that we're interpreting that analysis is really critical to the picture that we get at the end and whether we consider whether mineral nutrition is right or not. But if we've got all the way through, we've done all these things and we've decided that supplementation is definitely required, so the diet that our animals are being fed does not meet their mineral requirement, we then need to think about how we supplement. So I'm not going to go into these in too much detail, but I am happy to answer questions if people have got specifics. What I would say is what you need to be thinking about is which supplement suits your system. So is it that, are you already feeding a TMR? If you're already feeding a TMR, then mixing a bagged mineral into that TMR is the most logical solution. What you then need to think about is inorganic or organic minerals best? Is it a combination of both? What does that look like? Which minerals do I need to supply? Which minerals are already adequate in my diet? Am I going to buy an off-the-shelf mineral? Do I want a bespoke one made? All those considerations. You can also think about feeding it in compound feed. So a lot of the rolls, pellets, nuts that we see on the market are mineralized. So there'll be mineral coming from those feeds that we need to consider when we're looking at our whole diet analysis and how much. If we're thinking about more grass-based systems or forage-based systems, there are other options: buckets, licks, drenches, boluses, all options for these more sort of extensive systems. What I would add to that is they're appropriate for the trace elements that I've mentioned, probably not for the macro minerals that we've talked about. Much more difficult to supplement them via drenches or boluses, but definitely appropriate for trace elements if trace element nutrition is what's required in the diet. So the final slide, and just what I want to leave you with when thinking about mineral supplementation of cattle, is just to go through these kind of thought process of what is effective supplementation. So what should we be looking for? And with effective supplementation, we should be looking for it to be necessary. We don't want to be supplementing cows that actually their diet is already supplying them with their mineral requirement. So how do we work out whether supplementation is necessary? We do mineral audits, we check the status, we start to put that jigsaw puzzle together using our testing, using our analysis, using our diagnostics to work out whether we need to supplement and which minerals we need to supplement with. Effective supplementation should fulfill animal requirement. So the reason I've written that is because we don't want to undersupply, but we also don't want to oversupply. So we don't want to be supplementing animals with large amounts of minerals that are over and above their requirement, with a little caveat of some of the things that I've mentioned where we're starting to see some evidence for nutraceutical use. but that should absolutely be targeted. We should have a reason why we're supplying above animal requirement, why we're supplying above values that we would maybe have rationed in the past for. We need to really think strategically about adding those minerals and vitamins to the diet, and the reason we're doing it, where in the production cycle we're doing it, and have a targeted approach to that sort of supplementation. And then the final thing is that effective supplementation should allow animals to perform to their genetic potential. So animals will not perform at their best. We don't get that lubrication of the body's processes. We don't get that utilization of feed, that feed efficiency that we're looking for, if their mineral status is suboptimal. So really important that we consider those things when we think about effective supplementation. So that was the last slide. My contact details are on the bottom of the slide on all sorts of different social media. You'll find me, so please do feel free, or I'm happy to contact me on there or ask questions now. Hand you back to Cara.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Annie. I think that's been a really useful kind of whirlwind tour of mineral nutrition in cattle, and definitely highlighted some points for me. We have got some questions that have come in, so we'll just get kick-started with that. But if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A box and we will get through some of them now for you. Okay. So earlier in your presentation, you were talking about mineral balance, and obviously this avoiding the oversupply, undersupply of different minerals. When you're out on farm, what are you typically seeing? Are you seeing farms that are more oversupplying or undersupplying? What are you seeing out on farm?
I think that's where we've got a real discrepancy between dairy and beef. In beef, I'd say we're still at a stage where the majority, well, not the majority is probably the wrong word. We've still got a significant number of farms that are undersupplying, and animals could probably perform better if they increased the amount of mineral in the diet, or looked at their balance of mineral in the diet and got that more aligned with what the animal requires. In dairy, I think we see the opposite. I spend a lot of my time reviewing mineral specs and reducing the amount of mineral in dairy diets. I think particularly in dairy, we have a lot of seeing mineral coming in from lots of different sources. So they're supplying, let's say they're supplying mineral in a TMR, but then there's also a robot that's got a bit of compound feed going through it. There's a few buckets out. We're seeing mineral coming in lots of sources, and we need to do like a full audit of what's happening on that farm and strip some of those sources out, so that we're actually, again, going to that animal requirement. So yeah, differences between the two sectors, I would say. Dairy oversupply, beef undersupply.
And is it any particular minerals that you're seeing, or is it just every mineral they're over or undersupplying with?
No, I think there are certain ones. I mean, copper comes up time and time again. I think I do genuinely think we're getting better. I think we used to see it far more in excessive requirement than we do now, but we still do see farms where it's massively in over animal requirement. And perhaps they used to have an antagonist problem. That antagonist problem has reduced, but the copper in the diet hasn't reduced. The other one that probably we see above requirement is phosphorus. And a lot of farms oversupplying phosphorus in the diet of cows, because I guess it's probably only come on the agenda in the last couple of years that we should be starting to look at phosphorus balance. So yeah.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, what is your advice for chelated minerals? I've probably said that wrong.
Chelated.
There we go.
So chelated minerals are really interesting. I think that it depends on the mineral as to how much evidence there is that it's better than an inorganic. So probably for those that don't know, a chelated mineral is bound to an amino acid. So that amino acid hopefully helps its transport within the digestive tract and therefore the absorption into the animal. We definitely see advantages in monogastrics. I think the papers that are being published are still a little bit, we see discrepancies in those papers in terms of their performance in ruminants. So some chelated minerals, we see a definite improvement in absorption and therefore the effect they have on the animal. Some we don't. It's really difficult to like pin your hat on, yes, this will definitely have an effect. But I think we're getting there towards a greater understanding of how those minerals are actually metabolized in the animal. So yes, certainly when we start talking potentially about higher yielding or higher performing animals, I think we are getting to a point where we are starting to recommend what we'd say organic or more chelated minerals to help to improve performance in those.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got one that's a bit of a they've seen this problem on their own. So this spring we had several beef cows develop udder oedema. I did test for calcium, phosphorus, and selenium in these cows, most of which came back as normal. Have you found that with these cases this is potentially caused by mineral issues, or do you think it's more dietary issues?
This is one of those, like I was saying on the slide I had up for phosphorus, these are all the things you might see with phosphorus, but you can't say that it's definitely that similar. It's really difficult when we see these sorts of, there obviously something is wrong, something is not right within those animals. It's really difficult to work out exactly what it is. I mean, those tests that have been done there are macro minerals. I'd probably have a look at trace element status. Are we supplying enough trace elements in those the diet of those animals? But again, yeah, I'd be reviewing everything in terms of how those animals are being managed, the nutrition being put in front of them to try and get to a solution as to why that happened. Because yeah, one of those things where it's difficult to say that is definitely caused by this.
No, I think that's one of the hardest things is with a lot of these symptoms that you see, it could be a whole variety of things that can actually be causing it.
Yeah, you've got to kind of go through a process of elimination to what is out of balance here. I think we used to say what's low, what's high. Now it's more complicated than that. It's what's out of balance.
Okay, we've got a couple more. So when you were talking about testing and doing your kind of forage analysis and then also doing testing of the animals themselves, when in the year is the best time to do those tests? Obviously, the forage analysis is once it's been in the clamp, you've got that bit. But for the animals, when's the best time to do it?
So for the animals, in terms of if we're going to blood test, liver sample, I'd be targeting critical points in the production cycle. So where can we really afford for this not to go wrong? You know, so if we're thinking about things like fertility, or we've got fertility issues, we want to be testing before those animals go to the bull, before they're AI'd, whatever that might be, so that we've got a period of time then to do something about it. You know, if we test the day before they go to the bull and then they come back and we go, oh, actually they're low in selenium, it's too late. That we've not given ourselves enough window to start to do anything about it. So I'd be testing about 2 months prior to that period. The other thing to think about in terms of testing and when we do it is what your system is in terms of how animals move around the farm. So some of those tests, like I said, are iodine is responsive to our current diet now. So if we're testing, let's say we're testing cattle now, and we intend for them to go onto a fodder crop next week, or we intend to them to change to a different part of the farm next week, our test is telling us what's happening right now. It's not going to tell us when we move them next week that that's going to be okay. So it's looking at it. What are the critical pinch points in your production cycle where a mineral might affect how those animals perform, and testing before we reach that pinch point, not at it. or thinking about how do our animals rotate around our farm? Where do we really want to measure what the nutrition is going into those animals? So yeah, two different ways of looking at it.
Mm-hmm. And are you seeing more farmers going down the route of testing animals?
Definitely seeing more and more, which is great because it gives you a much better picture of what's actually happening. We can be absolutely certain that we actually know we have got these animals in the normal range. We don't think we're impeding their performance because their minerals aren't right. So yeah, we're seeing way more farmers doing mineral forage analysis and more farmers actually testing animals. I still think we're probably at the stage where most of the testing happens in the animal because of a result of a problem rather than a routine. But I think we are starting to get there. We're seeing more diagnostic testing.
Brilliant. That's great to hear. And yeah, and it just means we can really focus on how to supplement them the best then.
Definitely, yeah.
Going to put you on the spot a bit. For a dairy cow, what is the most important mineral to consider, and the same for a beef cow?
Oh, that is on the spot. That's really difficult. For a dairy cow, what is our a dairy cow, it has to be calcium. We're expecting them to produce milk. They cannot produce milk if we can't get calcium into their diet. That one's definitely a cop out. That's what I'm going for. For beef, what are we going to say? I think for beef, probably for beef, our most important aspect is growth, isn't it? We need these animals to grow, put weight on, live weight gain, muscle development. I think we've got to be considering selenium in beef. Are we getting the selenium right, particularly in those continental beef breeds? A lot of muscle development happening really early on. Are we giving them enough selenium, enough vitamin E to enable them to perform as we genetically think they ought to be able to?
Okay, brilliant. I have one more question that's just popped in. Should a mycotoxin binder be fed in a bespoke mineral or separate?
Yeah, so it depends on how the mycotoxin binder works. So it depends on its mode of action and how it's binding the toxin in the silage. So you need to check with the manufacturer of the binder what its mode of action is as to whether it can be fed with a mineral or whether it's going to bind mineral as well. Essentially, that's the problem. Is it going to bind the mineral that we're putting into the diet or not?
So all I would like to say is, firstly, thank you very much to everyone who's joined this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have any questions post-webinar, please do get in touch. You've seen Annie's got a variety of different social media platforms. Go give her a follow. She is always sharing lots of interesting new information about minerals. And finally, a very big thank you to Annie for coming on and doing this webinar tonight. So thank you very much, Annie.
Thanks, everyone.